Okay, so today we're going to talk about hieroglyphics, which many of you probably know or have figured out already, is the name that we give the writing that the ancient Egyptians used. Now, what's weird is it's not the name that the ancient Egyptians used for their own writing. They called their writing Medo-Neger. That's an actually ancient Egyptian, and it means God's words. When they did their writing, they believed that it was so important that one of the best jobs you could have, besides being a pharaoh, was being a scribe. A scribe is a person who does writing. They valued a person who did writing so much that they were almost as good as being a pharaoh. Not quite as good as being a pharaoh or a priest, but almost as good. You were a really big deal if you could learn to write the God's words. Now, hieroglyphics, what we call them, comes from Greek. Because after the Egyptians had their ancient Egypt, Greece kind of went on a conquering festival and conquered a lot. That's where all of the ancient Greek mythology comes from. And when they saw the hieroglyphics, when they saw the writing that the ancient Egyptians did, they gave it a different name. They said that it was sacred writing. Glyphics means writing or markings. So when writing upside down, when the ancient Greeks found all of this leftover writing that the ancient Egyptians left behind, and then that part of their society kind of stopped, they saw it and they thought, wow, this is on like the insides of tombs. This is right next to where really important people are buried. So it must be important. And they named it sacred writing. That's where the word hieroglyphics comes from. Sacred writing. And that part is Greek. Now, there are a lot of things to talk about hieroglyphics, and we're not going to talk about all of them today because we'd be sitting here for hours. So I want to tell you a couple of the things, and then we can do more research. Remember, we have all of our Egypt books over there. So the first thing to know about hieroglyphics is that they are complicated. If you were a scribe, if you were the person whose job it was to learn to write the hieroglyphics, you would have to learn between 1,000 and about 700 different symbols. Think about English. We have 20-something letters in the alphabet, and you have to learn the capital and the lowercase version for them. But there's only 26 different things to make. Imagine having to learn 1,000 different symbols that all had different meanings. If you were going to become a scribe, you would start training when you were about 10 years old. Quietly raise your hand if you are old enough to be a scribe. You would start going to scribe school if you are about 10 years old or older, and you had good control with your hands. If when you practiced doing work with your hands, people noticed that you were good at it, they noticed you had a good memory, then they might send you to school to be a scribe. And in ancient Egypt, that was about the only thing you went to school for. If you were going to have any other job, you would be what's called an apprentice, where you would find someone who has the job and you would follow them around and they would teach you. It's a very nice way to learn, but it's not a way that we use very often in our culture anymore. School, like we have, where we sit and we work on things together and have lessons together, that's something that in ancient Egypt was only for the scribes. They would sit and practice writing some more, and practice writing some more for years and years until they were good enough to really be a scribe, to really know all 1,000 different symbols. And you might be thinking to yourself, wow, that's not a job I want, 1,000 symbols. But remember, in ancient Egypt, that was one of the only things you could do that would get people to really respect you, to really think you're super important. So people felt really good if they could be a scribe. Now, 1,000 symbols, what's up with that? There's not 1,000 different sounds. Why would there be 1,000 symbols? This is where it gets tricky. The ancient Egyptians didn't write their words with sounds. If they wanted to write about a house, there would be a picture like this. If I showed you this picture and asked you what it is, most of you would probably be like, yeah, that's clearly a house. Ready? When I give you a thumbs up, go ahead and say what you think this picture is of. Ready?
A sun.
Yeah. So this would work. Let's see. How about, don't say it till I give you a thumbs up. How about this?
Cat.
So, many hieroglyphics were a picture that stood for a whole concept, like a house, a whole noun, or sometimes a whole verb. Look at this one. Don't say this one because this is a tricky one. Ready? Let's imagine, I clearly am not allowed to be a scribe in ancient Egypt, that this is a leg and that's a foot. If you saw this symbol on a wall in ancient Egypt, it might mean foot. It might mean leg. Those are nouns. It might mean run. It's a verb. It might mean fast. It might mean walk. It might mean travel. It might mean journey. You getting where I'm going? One symbol can mean a lot of things, which means if you walk up to a wall where there's a bunch of hieroglyphics, you can't just sound them out and read them. It's not like you walk up to this symbol on a wall and you go k, a, t. In ancient Egypt, you walk up to the symbol on a wall and you go, okay, well, what's around it? Let's think about what would make sense. If there's an illustration, if there's a picture, what would make sense? Well, let's see. If it also shows a picture of a cart, then maybe logically it has something to do with travel. Maybe we can assume that travel is what's going on there. But there's a lot of figuring out that has to be done to make hieroglyphics make sense. Now, there's one more. While this symbol could mean foot and leg and run and fast and walk and travel, it could also mean the sound at the beginning of the word leg. So in English, it could make the sound O. They used the sound words too, but they were also all mixed in. So sometimes when you saw a picture, it would mean a sound. And sometimes when you saw a picture, it would mean a noun or a verb. It was a super complicated way to write. And that's part of why scribes were given so much respect. Because they thought, wow, you've got to really put in a lot of work. You have to work really hard to be able to read and write this language. It's tricky. It's not easy. Even English is tricky enough to learn to read and write. But ancient Egyptian in hieroglyphics was really, really complicated. Now, while our good friends, the ancient Egyptians, were hanging out, writing their hieroglyphics, they had some friends. Their friends were called the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians, that's a PH, very fancy. The Phoenicians were traders. They were people who traded. That was their job. That was how they made their money. Well, not money, but how they got enough food and things to live. The Egyptians mostly were farmers. We talked about the Nile and how the Nile was a really lovely place to farm next to. Well, the Phoenicians used the Nile for something else. They traveled up and down the Nile in their boats. And they would land at one city and sell some stuff and get some new stuff. And then go to another city and sell some stuff and get some new stuff. We'll talk more about the sorts of things the Phoenicians got another time. But the main point here is that they're traveling all over. And they wanted to keep records of what they bought and sold. But when they met the Egyptians and the Egyptians were like, hey, want to learn our way of writing? The Phoenicians, who were busy sailing their boats back and forth up and down the river, were like, dude, we do not have time for that. We don't have time. This is insane. I can't spend 4 years learning how to do this writing just so I can say that I picked up some honey in that little town. And so the Phoenicians said, no. The way you guys write, I mean, thanks for offering to share, but it's a little much. It's too much. Let's make it easier. You might have heard the word phonetic before. We talk about phonetic words when we're learning to read and write because phonetic words are words that you can sound out. So like how cat is k-a-t. There's no tricky things. there are some words that you can't sound out properly, like the word the. If you make the sounds of these letters, the word the is not what comes out of your mouth. This is not a phonetic word. The word phonetic comes from the Phoenicians. Look, phonetic, Phoenicians. This root word means sound. The Phoenicians said, for every symbol that the ancient Greeks have, this is my really lovely foot again, we are going to throw out all the meanings except for one. We are only going to keep one meaning. We're going to say that this picture of a leg makes the sound that the word leg starts with. In English, it would make ol. They decided that every single symbol will stand for one sound. They invented an alphabet. The word alphabet was not invented yet, but they invented what we would now call an alphabet, where when you make a symbol, it tells your brain to make a sound. Right here, I have an example of one version of a hieroglyphic alphabet. We can do some experimenting with this as our follow-up. But, I want to tell you so many things. You know what? We're going to need to do hieroglyphics part 2 tomorrow, I think, so that we don't go for too long. But the last thing I want to tell you is this. For a very long time, people found hieroglyphics. They found this really lovely writing on walls of pyramids and on rocks and on jars and all sorts of things. But they didn't know what it meant because there was no one around who still understood this language. All the scribes had died. The people of ancient Egypt eventually changed the way they did their language, and hieroglyphics stopped being a thing. And by the time modern people found them, it was total code. They had no idea what it meant until they found something special. This thing right here is just a picture of a rock. Yes, I know. But it is a very big deal. This is called the Rosetta Stone. Give me a nod if you've ever heard that word before. It's okay if you have, it's okay if you haven't. The Rosetta Stone was a proclamation. So imagine you're in like a medieval town and somebody walks up and goes, I have a proclamation to read. The king demands that on next Saturday, all the princesses and princes in town come to a ball. That would be a proclamation. This was a proclamation, but it was written for everyone. Please observe if you are currently scooting. This section was written in hieroglyphics. This section was written in another language that we'll talk about another day. And this section was written in ancient Greek. No one knew how to read hieroglyphics when they found this, but they knew ancient Greek. And they figured out that it was the exact same words. So they used this stone to break the code. Somebody sat around for literal years and broke the code to figure out how to read hieroglyphics. If people hadn't found this stone, it would still be total mystery to us. All right, we're going to stop there for today.